Well, let's talk a little bit about what the ridiculousness that is this has taught me about this. One of the biggest goals when I make one of these things is I always want it to sound as sensible as possible. So anytime I can make a chord progression that works or that you might expect to hear, that's always preferable. Now, it doesn't always work because sometimes people talking is just all over the place.
Like I was thinking, right? Guess what, bitch?
And it's extremely difficult to make any sense of it at all. But whenever there is an opportunity, I like to try to work the speech into a chord progression that makes sense, that's something that you might expect to hear. And I think that's what really helps some of them come together and sound like a cohesive composition.
Have you ever had a dream
Here's what's unique about doing the dubs, the piano dubs, or whatever you want to call them. There is a melody in whatever a person is saying and pulling the notes out of that. That doesn't change. I can't manipulate that. Whatever the melody is what it is. And the content musically that's coming out of somebody's mouth, I'm stuck with it. I gotta use it. Whatever it is, that's my melody. So what I'm then tasked with is figuring out, okay, if I have this melody that's set in stone, there's nothing I can do about it, how can I turn it into something that sounds good? Which is often a struggle. But when it works, it works. And I have figured out some tools that I go back to time and time again that really make this thing work well. And in the simplest possible terms, I'm gonna explain it to you. There's a couple really, really basic things that I wanna lay out before we jump into this, and that's because a lot of you are musicians, a lot of you probably know this, but some of you maybe are not, and that's totally okay too, so I don't wanna leave anybody in the dust. There's two main things that we're dealing with here. We're dealing with scales, and we're dealing with chords. So for all intents and purposes, we're looking at this from a jazz perspective, in which case we try to make things as simple as possible so that we can describe them and be able to play things in any key easily. And to do that, we just use numbers. I've talked a little bit about it before, but if you take a scale, all we're gonna do is we're just gonna assign a number to each one of those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then this is 1 repeated. We have that as a start. Now, if we take that and we move it over to chords, we're doing the same thing. A chord is built like this. At a very basic level, a basic triad, the chord is the first note of the scale, the third note of the scale, and the fifth note of the scale. 1, 3, 5. Super simple, right? In jazz, we usually use a 4-note chord as sort of a baseline. The next addition to that initial 3 notes is going to be 1, 3, 5, 7. A 7th chord. Sometimes that 7th can be major. Sometimes it can be what we call dominant, which is where we take that 7th, we make it flat, right? Maybe we make the whole chord minor and add that flat 7 again, so we have a minor 7. We can do any sort of combination. Now, one more important concept that we need to understand is how we get all of these things. Because you probably hear a lot of a chord labeled and then there's like a bunch of numbers. So maybe it's 11 or 13 or 9. And maybe those have a sharp or a flat in front of them. What does all that mean? Well, we have that first scale and we showed that it had numbers, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That brings us back to 1 repeated. But what happens if we go outside of that first octave? Well, it's really simple. We're just going to continue building up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. You could think of this as 8, right? Then we get to 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So when we build a chord, we can literally go 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. And theoretically, if you're Jacob Collier, you could get back to 15. So if you have like a C major 7, sharp 11, sharp 15, when we talk about those numbers that go above that first 7 or 8 notes, we refer to those as upper extensions because they are upper, they're above the first octave where the basic chord is contained, and then extensions, they're this chord with extensions on it to add color to the voicing. So I tell you all that so that you understand we are looking at this massive array of notes that we can use to build chords. Why this is particularly useful when we're talking about putting Cardi B into music is because when we're dealing with random notes all over the place, which is what we get when we transcribe somebody talking, we have to figure out how are we going to make this into chords that potentially work. Because if I just did a thing where, you know, say somebody's voice went, I don't know, chromatic, some sort of thing like that, if I was just throwing chords around like, There's not a whole lot of rhyme or reason to that. In terms of just like, what is our ear gonna hear and be like, oh yeah, I know what that sounds like. That's not it. So we have to then figure out, well, how are we gonna make it sound like something that makes any amount of sense at all? And the answer is that we're going to try to brute force the melody notes to work with the harmony that we want the melody notes to work with. So if you're a musician that does a lot of transcribing, you can look at any one of my videos and I'm sure you wouldn't have much trouble transcribing what I'm actually doing. And what you'd probably find is that there are a number of instances where the melody note in comparison with the chord that I'm playing is a very bizarre choice. There are two things that can happen there. Number one, it cannot work at all, but I just don't care because it's such a brief moment passing in time that your ear doesn't care either. Therefore, you'll pay more attention to the harmony as a whole, and you won't pay as much attention to that one melody note that's totally out of place and doesn't work at all. The other way is to adjust my chord so that whatever the melody note is simply just works in that chord. Now, I can do that using those upper extensions that we talked about. Here's what I mean. If I have a melody note of a G, and for whatever reason I really want the chord to be C, well, that's not too difficult because the note is G. That's the fifth of the C chord. Problem solved, we're done, we can go home. But what happens if that note is not a G and it's some strange note in comparison to the chord that I really want to use, which in this case might be C? What if my note is an A flat? Well, actually, that chord by itself sounds pretty cool. That actually sounds really sick. So I might just use that, I don't know. If it did not aid to the overall harmonic progression or the concept that I'm trying to use in this particular moment, I would need to make some alterations. So say, for example, I was coming from a G minor chord and I really needed this chord to be dominant, and say I wanted to go after that to F, so I'm creating just a typical 2-5-1 movement. What if I get to that C and my melody note is not a G, it's that A flat, right? Well, in fact, you may have just heard, it still works. Because instead of just a simple voicing where it's just like a regular 4-note voicing, now all of a sudden we start to introduce some of these upper extensions that we talked about, okay? So in this chord, what have we already decided on? Well, we've decided that we're using 1, 3, 5, and flat 7 because we want it to be a dominant chord. But we have this A flat to deal with. So it's like, well, how does that fit into A flat? What upper extension is that A flat when we are in the key of C there? Well, if you look at the scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, but we made it flat. So what we ended up with here is this C dominant with a flat 13. So then it becomes a question of like, okay, well, I've got a flat 13, so now what do I do with it? Can I just play the chord and play the flat 13 and think nothing else of it? Sure can, that sounds pretty great. But can I do even more with it to kind of make it sound a little bit more involved, make some more alterations? Sure. What do I have at my disposal that I haven't used yet? I've used 1, 3, 5, and 7, and I've used 13. Well, what's left? Theoretically, we have the 9 and the 11. But that doesn't sound good at all. So if we were going to include the 9 and the 11, maybe we try a sharp 11. Still a little odd. What about taking the 9 and making it sharp? Could work, it's a little strange. Let's move that 11 again. That's spicy. That could work. What about, let's go back to natural here, and instead of sharp 9, let's do flat 9. This sounds to me like it wants to go minor. So it wants to go. See what I mean? It kind of, the voicing just sort of feels like it's leading to a darker, more minor place. So you can already kind of see how like, it almost doesn't matter what the melody note is because we can find a way to work it into a chord that makes sense. And if it doesn't work, then okay, we call it a passing tone, use the chord that we want, and say, I just don't care, because your ear's not going to hear it. Your ear's going to be like, all right, I accept that. We'll move on to the next thing. This way of thinking sort of led me to another way to approach voicings that I had before. Now, I get questions a lot about how do you know what scale to use when you're playing over certain chords? All you have to do is fill in the chord. If I take a C minor 7th chord, we have 4 notes: C, the flat 3, which is E flat, 5, G, and the flat 7, which is B flat. Here's the chord. What's the scale that goes with it? What do we need to make a scale? We literally are 3 notes away from making a full scale. We already have 4. There's only 7 notes in a scale most of the time. So we have 4 of them already decided: C, E flat, G, and B flat. All we gotta do is figure out what the other 3 are. This is the thing. We get too caught up sometimes on definitions and names of things and what is a Lydian dominant, what's the altered scale, what's the name of this, name of that. And it's important stuff to know at a certain level, and that's great. But don't get hung up on it, because all you need to do is answer the question of what is satisfying to the ear. Let's figure it out. And once we're thinking of it from the standpoint of we already have 4 notes, we just need to figure out 3 more, it becomes way easier. We already have 4. What degrees of the scale are those 4? It's the 1st, it's the 3rd, it's the 5th, it's the 7th. What's left? The 2nd, the 4th, and the 6th, which if we jump those up to the upper extensions, they become the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th. See how everything is kind of like starting to fall into place, right? So all we need to do is answer the question of what variation of those 2, 4, 6, or 9, 11, 13, what variation do we want? Do we want the naturally occurring one? Do we want any one of them to be flat? Do we want any one of them to be sharp? If we answer that question, then we can all of a sudden realize, like, hey, we have a whole scale here. My question is answered. I don't need to know what scale to use with this chord because I just answered it myself. And I don't even care what it's called because here it is right in front of me and I can play it. I don't care what it's called. We have 4. Let's figure out the other 3. Well, let's start with the 2nd. Do I like that? Nope, I don't really like that. Do I like this? I like that a lot. So we just answered the question of what is our 2nd, or in the upper extension form, the 9th. And it's just natural, it's the D. So now we move on to the 4th, or the 11th. And we say, what works here? Well, how about a sharp 4? How about no? How about a natural 4? Beautiful. Gorgeous. I love that sound right there. That is amazing, okay? And we only have 1 left. It's the 6th, or in upper extension form, the 13th. We've answered the 2nd, we've answered the 4th. Now, are we gonna take the flat 6? It's not super offensive. That could work. And depending on the context, maybe we want that sound. Let's try natural 6. I like that much better. And maybe in the context of all the other chords around it, I prefer the flat 6, maybe. But in general, that sound right there is beautiful to me. I really like that sound. So what is that? There's our scale, done. Problem solved. Like that's literally it. That's all you have to worry about. Because now, that's the whole scale. There's nothing else to figure out. And if you don't know the name of it, who cares? Seriously, like who cares? You don't need to know the name of it. Can you learn the name of it and have that useful? Because then you can think about it in terms of, well, what would this be in another key and understand the definition of it and be able to spell it out? Like, sure, yeah, there's a huge value to learning the name of it, but don't get caught up on it because what that is right there is C Dorian. That is the 2nd mode of the major scale. Have I already lost you? Maybe so, in which case, again, I say, don't worry about what it's called. So you can see how like thinking about harmony in these different ways and thinking like, well, I don't care what the melody note is because I'll find a way to make it some altered upper extension of a chord so that it works for where I'm trying to be and where I'm trying to go at any given moment. That's how I've been able to take these whacked out melodies that are the result of people speaking and turn them into something where the context actually makes sense, where the context actually sounds like a chord progression that's not random, that sounds like something you might expect to hear. And that helps the overall video seem much more coherent because the more the harmony makes sense, the better it's gonna sound. And just before we wrap this up, I wanna share with you one of my favorite ones that I've done so far in terms of how the composition sort of wound up sounding. It was just one of those ones that seemed to work well in terms of getting those melody notes to fall into a chord progression that made sense and actually created something that sounded almost like a piece that was intentionally written. You may have seen this already, it's pretty recent, but if you'd like to check it out, again, here it is. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.
On you.